Welcome to the first session, which is going to be on hemodiafiltration. My name is Kevin Tucker. This is my brief bio, and I have no disclosures that are relevant to this talk. So these are the learning objectives. At the end of this presentation, I hope that learners will be able to, 1, explain the physiological rationale for hemodiafiltration, 2, summarize the current evidence supporting hemodiafiltration, and 3, identify practical considerations for implementation of high-volume hemodiafiltration. So I'm going to start with an audience response question, and that is, my experience with hemodiafiltration and other convective dialytic therapies is best characterized as extensive, minimal, or none. Please vote and let's see what your experience is. Okay, all right. So let's move on. So we know that mortality in adults on hemodialysis in the United States remains quite high. You can see that the adjusted all-cause mortality in adults per 1,000 person years is 296.8 for the oldest group of patients and 80.8 per 1,000 person years for the youngest group of patients. But regardless, the mortality for our patients on hemodialysis is quite high relative to a non-dialysis cohort of the same age. When we think about what the causes of death are in our dialysis patients, there are 2 big categories. The first are cardiovascular disease, deaths, and the second are infectious deaths. And so if you look at this pie chart, you can see that arrhythmia and cardiac arrest account for the greatest proportion of deaths and the greatest proportion of cardiac deaths. But things like congestive heart failure, acute myocardial infarction, and atherosclerotic heart disease account for a smaller proportion of those cardiovascular deaths. So anything that we can do that will mitigate cardiovascular mortality is likely to improve our overall survival of our hemodialysis patients. So maybe perhaps some of it is related to solute clearance. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about solute clearance that kind of goes back to our patient panel discussion on adequacy of dialysis. So urea is the prototype small solute. The UTOX classification system has designated those solutes with a mass less than 500 daltons as low molecular mass solutes. And urea has served as that prototype for free low molecular mass urine solutes, i.e. the small solutes. Urea clearance can approach the extracorporeal blood flow because urea moves rapidly out of red blood cells as well as the plasma during the passage of blood through the dialyzer. It has a low mass, and the diffusivity of small solutes declines with increased mass. Diffusive clearance can be represented by what's called a mass transfer coefficient for that solute. On the other hand, we have larger solutes that are designated as middle molecules. So solutes with a mass between 500 and 45,000 daltons are designated as middle molecules in the UTOX classification. The middle molecules have a reduced clearance relative to urea. Increasing the mass slows the rate at which those solutes diffuse, and increasing the mass eventually keeps solutes from entering the fluid channels in the membrane through which they must pass to get from the blood to the dialysate side of the membrane. Beta-2 microglobulin is the prototype middle molecule. In the 1980s, there was increasing evidence that beta-2 microglobulin, I apologize for that typo, beta-2 microglobulin caused dialysis-related amyloidosis. This finding promoted efforts to use membranes that are more permeable to larger solutes. Hence, beta-2 microglobulin has been adopted as the prototype larger solute or middle molecule. Now, there's this important concept of the sieving coefficient. So the sieving coefficient basically tells us how well solutes are removed with the ultrafiltrate. And so you can see that as we move from low flux dialyzers to high flux dialyzers, we get greater clearance of these larger solutes with these high flux membranes. With medium cutoff dialyzers, which we'll talk about towards the end of the talk, we get even greater clearance of larger solutes. So we can manipulate to a certain extent how much of a solute we can remove just by manipulating the dialysis membrane. Which brings us to the HEMO study, which was a study that was conceived in the early 1990s and studied our dialysis population at that time. It had a 2x2 factorial design in which patients were randomized to be dialyzed with a high flux dialyzer with a high dose of dialysis, or a high flux of dialysis with a standard dose, a low flux dialyzer with a high dose of dialysis, or a low flux dialyzer with a standard dose of dialysis. The KTRV goals were based upon the equilibrated KTRV, which is slightly lower than the single pool KTRV. And you can see that the goal for those randomized to the standard dose was an EKTRV of 1.05, which corresponds to a single pool KTRV of about 1.2 to 1.3, and a high dose KTRV of 1.45, which would correlate to a single pool KTRV of about 1.6 to 1.7. The survival curves for the two groups were the same. So you can see that for standard dose and high dose, there was no difference in survival. And you can see that for flux of the dialyzer, there was no difference in survival either. So the conclusion was that there was no evidence that a higher dose of dialysis improved mortality, and there was no evidence that high flux dialysis improved mortality relative to low flux dialysis. And I think that the HEMO study sort of made us think perhaps that there was no reason to really change anything that we were doing with respect to hemodialysis, because increasing the dose of dialysis did not change outcomes. However, what was not taken into account here was the fact that we weren't taking into account time on dialysis, which could affect volume removal and the clearance of other solutes. One of the other considerations is whether or not there's more to survival than small solute clearance. So should we consider more than urea in terms of thinking about the adequacy of dialysis? So solute removal in hemodialysis occurs mostly by diffusion, because diffusion coefficients decrease rapidly with increasing molecular size. The removal of larger uremic toxins is modest in conventional hemodialysis. Contrast that with hemofiltration. Solute removal in hemofiltration occurs by convection. Small solute removal is modest because it cannot exceed the ultrafiltration rate. Hemofiltration provides greater clearance of larger solutes than hemodialysis. The sieving coefficient, which together with ultrafiltration rate determines convective clearance, decreases only gradually with increasing molecular size, as compared to hemodialysis, where it increases rapidly with increasing molecular size. So hemodiafiltration provides both the high diffusive clearance of small solutes obtained in hemodialysis plus enhanced removal of larger solutes obtained with hemofiltration. So what are some of the potential outcomes that could be related to the clearance of larger solutes? Well, mortality is an obvious one. Cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, perhaps related to vascular calcification, inflammation, and then quality of life measures, things like sleep, fatigue, and pruritus, which are very important patient-related outcomes, might be related to the clearance of these larger solutes. So the question becomes, is there a benefit of more convective clearance? Hemodiafiltration is not widely practiced in the United States, although that may be beginning to change. It is more commonly utilized in Europe and in Japan, and it utilizes a substitution fluid to provide that convective clearance, much as we do in CVVH in the intensive care unit. So I'm going to walk you through some of the trials that have been published looking at hemodiafiltration. Most of these trials are from Europe, where hemodiafiltration is practiced more commonly than it is in the United States. And the first of these trials was the contrast trial, which looked at low flux hemodialysis versus hemodiafiltration. And you can see in this trial that there was no difference in survival or cardiovascular events between those who were randomized to low flux hemodialysis and online hemodiafiltration. Now, you might think that this is not even a fair comparison, because low flux hemodialysis has even less removal of the larger solutes than high flux hemodialysis. But even looking at low flux hemodialysis versus online hemodiafiltration, in this study, there was no difference in survival between the two groups. If you look at the risk of all-cause mortality and fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events stratified by convection volume, what you can see, however, is that as the convection volume increased, there appeared to be a trend towards better survival for both total mortality and for fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events. So perhaps part of the key question here is whether or not because they were not achieving a high convection volume, that contributed to the lack of a survival benefit for hemodiafiltration. If you look at beta-2 microglobulin levels in the two studies, however, you can see that those who were randomized to online HGF did have better removal of beta-2 microglobulin compared to those who were randomized to low flux hemodialysis. Again, not a surprising finding. Another study was the Turkish study, and in this study, you can see the composite event-free survival in patients who were treated with online HGF and high flux HGF. There does not appear to be a significant difference in survival between the two groups. However, again, if you stratify patients by convection volume, you can see that those who achieved a convection volume greater than 17 appear to have better overall survival and cardiovascular survival than those who had convection volumes that were less than or equal to 17.4, or for those who were randomized to high flux hemodialysis. In the Eshol study, this is a French study, the median convection volume achieved here was 22.9 to 23 liters. And you can see that in this study, there was a better survival for those who were randomized to online hemodiafiltration compared to those who were randomized to hemodialysis. Again, in this trial, higher convection volumes being achieved. And there was a 30% lower risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. And then finally, there was the Frenchy trial, which looked at a number of patient-related outcomes with respect to online hemodiafiltration and high flux hemodialysis. And the probability of survival, suffice it to say, despite this graph being very difficult to read, was no difference in the two groups. So to summarize these four trials, you can see that there was a contrast study, which is the first one that we looked at, mean follow-up of 3 years. The target convection volume was 24 liters per 4-hour session. Delivered convection volume was 20.7 liters per session. There were very few patients who actually were able to achieve that target convection volume. But what they found was that with intensive nursing support and education, they were gradually able to increase the number of patients who were actually able to achieve the target convection volume. The hazard for the primary outcome was 0.95, but the potential limitation of this trial was that they failed to deliver the target convection volume. In the Turkish study, this was high flux hemodialysis versus hemodiafiltration. Mean follow-up was 1.89 years. Target convection volume was greater than 15 liters per session, plus net ultrafiltrate. And you can see that the delivered convection volume was 17. Primary outcome was all-cause mortality plus non-fatal cardiovascular events, with a hazard for the primary outcome of 0.82, but you can see the confidence intervals crossing 1. This trial was underpowered. The Eshel study, high flux hemodialysis versus hemodiafiltration, mean follow-up of 1.91 years, target convection volume greater than 18, and most achieving that rate of 22.9 to 23.9 liters per session. Primary outcome, all-cause mortality, and you can see a 30% reduction for the primary outcome. And finally, the Frenchy trial, mean follow-up of 1.64 years, delivered convection volume 21 liters per session, looking at patient-related outcomes, intradialytic tolerance. The hazard for the primary outcome was 0.94, again, crossing the confidence intervals crossing 1, and again, this trial was also underpowered. Which brings us to the major trial that was published about 3 years ago now, the CONVINCE trial. This was a major trial from Europe in which they randomized 1,400 patients. 1,400 were assessed for eligibility, but ended up randomizing about 1,300. So 683 were assigned to and underwent high-dose hemodiafiltration, and 677 were assigned to and underwent high-flux hemodialysis. Now, pay careful attention to the baseline characteristics of the study patients. You can see that the average age for the two groups was 62 years. About 36% were female in the two groups. But notice that only about a third of the patients had diabetes. So this population is quite different from our population of patients here in the US. You can see that they had significant residual urinary output of about 850 ml per day. The median dialysis vintage was about 30 to 35 months in the two groups. And they had equivalent single pool KTRV for the two groups. The primary vascular access, about 80% was a fistula in both groups. And what you can see was that there was improved survival for those who were randomized to high-dose hemodiafiltration compared to those who were randomized to high-flux hemodialysis. And you can see by subgroups that those who were randomized to high-dose hemodiafiltration tended to do better, whether they were male or female, whether they had pre-existing diabetes or not, although you can see that for those with diabetes, the confidence intervals do cross 1. For dialysis vintage, less than 2 years or greater than 5 years, again, favoring high-dose hemodiafiltration compared to high-flux hemodialysis. If you look at the primary and secondary outcomes, death from any cause, the hazard was 0.77. showing a benefit of about 23% for those who were randomized to high-dose hemodiafiltration compared to those who were randomized to high-flux hemodialysis. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of hemodiafiltration. In hemodiafiltration, a dialysate and substitution fluid are prepared using a purification cascade that comprises reverse osmosis and two sterilizing ultrafilters. The high-flux dialyzer with polysulfone membranes acts as an additional endotoxin adsorber and provides additional microbial safety. The substitution fluid can be added at different points along the circuit. It can be post-dilution, pre-dilution, or so-called mixed dilution or mid-dilution. The gold standard is post-dilution, and that was what was used in the CONVINCE trial. Now, I want to move on and talk a little about some of the other forms of convective therapies. There's this concept that's been called expanded hemodialysis, which is a technique that uses what's called a high retention onset membrane dialyzer. HDX allows the clearance of larger molecules that typically require convection in order for them to be removed. So this is a trial that was published in CJSON looking at one of these medium cutoff dialyzers versus a high flux dialyzer. A relatively small trial, randomized about 86 patients to each of the two groups. And you can see that the medium cutoff dialyzer had better removal of lambda-free light chains compared to those who were randomized to the high flux dialyzer. Importantly, however, there was not a significant change in albumin, because one of the concerns with these medium cutoff dialyzers is that you're also going to remove some things that you don't want to remove, such as albumin. But if you look at the removal of beta-2 microglobulin, gamma-free light chains, complement factor D, tumor necrosis factor, kappa-free light chains, and IL-6, the Theranova 400 fared better for most of these compared to the Licio 17H dialyzer. So this gives us a new glossary of terms that I think we should become familiar with. So we are all familiar with the general concept of renal replacement therapy, CRRT, intermittent hemodialysis. But we now have some of these newer terms that include, HDF, hemodiafiltration, and expanded hemodialysis, and that is, or HGX, which uses these middle cutoff hemodialyzers that have the ability to remove some of these larger solutes that otherwise we could only remove with convective therapies. So the messages that I want you to take home from this talk on hemodiafiltration are as follows. Dialysis adequacy in the United States has focused historically on small solute or urea clearance. The larger solutes, the middle molecules, may be responsible for some of the excess morbidity and mortality in end-stage kidney disease. Convective clearance is more efficient at removal of middle molecules. Hemodiafiltration is a dialytic modality that provides both diffusive and convective clearance. Hemodiafiltration, commonly used in Europe, may be emerging in the United States. We know that it's being rolled out in the United States in some of the large dialysis organizations. And these are some references for you on hemodiafiltration.